one because it is so complex. And it's just a pleasure to be here to see Professor Dinar and the terrific work that he's doing. You all must be immensely proud of the community here. So this is a timely topic because yes. Is this a little better?
Yes.
Okay. I'll try not to wander then.
Amara, if you want to walk around with it, that could work as well, if that's your style.
Even better,
but
thank
just
you.
stay in the camera's lens.
Okay. If you want to reform, that's fine, but not too much. It would be difficult for our policies. So in case you were wondering how timely this topic is, today's Washington Post had a terrific op-ed by David Ignatius, and he talks about Hezbollah. He identifies the challenge that we're talking about and tackling. He says, understanding Hezbollah is like watching a play of shadows. Its real actions are hidden. I wholeheartedly agree with this. I've spent a substantial time studying Hezbollah in Lebanon, working for the US government in an academic sense, in a policy sense. Indeed, I was actually part of a delegation accused of assassinating one of its officials a few years ago. You can imagine all 5 feet of me, I was surely involved in such a thing. I was not, for anyone listening, I was not. The Iranian press is actually not as legitimate as some may foolishly think. So tonight, here's what I'd like for us to do. I'd like for us to spend a little bit of time talking about what is Hezbollah and its various aspects. And then we'll talk a little bit about what's happening now in the region and how that affects Hezbollah. I suspect you'll probably have some questions on that topic. And then a little bit about what does this mean for the US government and what can it do? And I've arranged to save a good chunk of time for questions since I suspect you'll have some. So first of all, let me state the bottom line up front. This is something I was always taught with working with the military, is that your audience may fall asleep. So tell them your bottom line up front. In case they do, they'll at least remember the 1 or 2 sentences that you want them to walk away with. So the bottom line up front here is this. Hezbollah is an extremely complex organization, and its tactics for managing this complexity pose unique challenges to US foreign policy. So really, we're looking here at the uniqueness of Hezbollah and the complexity of it as an organization, and why this makes formulating US policy on it such a challenge. And when we look at the continuum of groups like Hezbollah, if you look at Muslim Brotherhood, if you look at Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah is different than all of them. It's much more capable than all of them. It's also much more diverse than all of them. And that's important to understand. And because of these roles, sometimes it plays more of a spoiler role, sometimes it plays more of a governing role. And I know I emphasize all of this because it's very easy to focus on the first aspect of Lebanon, which I'll talk about, which is, of Hezbollah, which is Hezbollah as a terrorist group. And it's important to understand there is more to Hezbollah than that. And I'm not justifying it or supporting it in any way. It's just, if we're going to formulate good policies towards this organization, we need to understand what it is. And how, in some ways, it's able to be so effective because of these various aspects. And before we get into Hezbollah and the intricacies of it, there's something else to remember, which is, where is Hezbollah's home? Hezbollah's home is Lebanon. And Lebanon, if you're familiar with it, is an extremely fragile state, and it's influenced by all of the major issues in the Middle East. In fact, I think you'd be hard-pressed to find some issue in the Middle East that does not touch on Lebanon in some way. If you're looking at the Arab-Israeli conflict, for example, you've had multiple Israeli invasions of Lebanon. You've had multiple terrorist groups attack Israel from Lebanon. You have estimates are of about 500,000 Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, so it's touched in that way. Iran, for example, clearly has a substantial presence in Lebanon because of its relationship with Hezbollah. Same thing with Syria. Iraq, you've seen relations there both within the Shia community and then also in terms of groups like Hezbollah going to train nefarious actors in Iraq. And if you look at terrorism issues, obviously Lebanon being really the birthplace of Middle Eastern suicide terrorism. If you look at religious issues, democratization issues, all of these touch upon Lebanon. And so it's important to understand that and to know that context when we're talking about Hezbollah. And Lebanon being an extremely diverse state, it's got 18 confessional groups, it's ruled by minorities, and this diversity has historically and continues today to be exploited by external actors from the West, from the region, you name it. So we're talking about a pretty complex context in which Hezbollah operates. So what are really the 3 major aspects that one looks at when we're trying to understand Hezbollah? Well, first, of course, we're talking about the terrorist aspect, right? This is the one we're probably all most familiar with, right? April 18th, 1983, bombing of the U.S. Embassy in Beirut. October 23rd, 1983, bombing of the Marine Barracks. The 1984 bombing of the U.S. Embassy in Beirut. These are all experiences that are seared in our memory, whether we were paying attention to these issues at that time or just historically. This is really what helped put Hezbollah on the map. As you may remember, before September 11th, 2001, Hezbollah was responsible for for the deaths of more Americans than any other terrorist group in the world. In fact, right after the September 11th attacks, there were U.S. government officials saying, actually, Hezbollah may be the A-team of terrorists because they managed to train so many other terrorist groups over the years. And that's a pretty worthwhile point. Hezbollah has had a global presence and maintains one today, although its last international terrorist attack was in the mid-90s in Argentina. It's also extremely well trained and equipped. And this is an issue that I look at personally, having been in the Defense Department, trying to build up some nascent militaries. Hezbollah receives its training and equipment, which I'll talk about a little bit later, from Syria and Iran. And as you're probably not surprised to know, they have different rules. These countries have different rules when they assist actors than the U.S. government does. So when the U.S. government gives assistance to the Egyptian military, there are certain things we say, right? So you can't give this assistance to terrorist groups. You need to respect human rights. You need to make sure you use this assistance properly, right? So you can't go kill civilians, etc. And as we see with the turmoil in the region, the U.S. government keeps a very active eye on what's happening with the material it gives. While you're surely not surprised to know, Iran and Syria have a bit of a different perspective. And unfortunately, they are also much more adept at sending their assistance. And this is one of the real challenges for U.S. policy that I think is a theme that will travel throughout here, which is that the actors that help assist Hezbollah are much more deft at assisting Hezbollah than the actors that the U.S. government will often support. So when the U.S. government wants to give aid to the Lebanese military, it takes a year plus to actually get that aid in Lebanon. And that's in the best case scenarios, almost always. Whereas when Iran and Syria want to do so, they're able to do it much more quickly. They don't have Congress to go to. And this is the beauty of our system in so many ways. I'm not criticizing it. I'm simply saying it's important to be cognizant that this is your competition, right? This is what you're trying to deal with. And when you're looking at capability, it's worth understanding that were Hezbollah to be a military, it would be among the more equipped and best trained, have the most sophisticated training of almost any military in the region. And that's a somewhat astonishing point. The fact that Hezbollah has received such sophisticated training and such sophisticated weaponry. We saw a lot of this in the summer 2006 and the way that Hezbollah was able to counter the Israeli Defense Forces. In fact, Secretary of Defense Gates made this very apt comment. He said, Syria and Iran are providing Hezbollah with so many rockets that they're at a point where they have more missiles than most governments in the world. So this is the kind of actor you're talking about. And keep that in the back of your head when we look at the political aspect. Everyone on the ground in Lebanon and in the region is also aware that this is the actor that they're talking about, an actor that is this capable. And that's what makes for a lot of what seems like perhaps less than satisfying decision making. So Hezbollah, because of these capabilities, while in some ways its ability to operate has been slightly minimized in some ways over the last few years. For instance, you have a more robust United Nations force in southern Lebanon. For instance, you have a more capable Lebanese armed force, Lebanese military, neither of which is in any way countering Hezbollah, but is merely a presence in a very limited area. But really, as we'll talk about, Hezbollah is still able to quite deftly do pretty much whatever it wants. And we've seen that in particular over these recent years. And while we're looking at it as a terrorist group, it's important to understand, yes, Hezbollah is playing a destabilizing role within the Levant, but also more broadly. I briefly mentioned the role Hezbollah has played in training forces that have helped kill American servicemen and women in Iraq. That's another point to be aware of. So sometimes when folks will say Hezbollah hasn't targeted American interests since 1984, well, in a very indirect manner they have, which is by training folks who then target Americans. If you're familiar, there was a weapon that was responsible for quite a few American deaths in Iraq in 2006, 2007. These EFPs, they're called. And those actually, it appears that much of the training for how to build those came from Hezbollah. So that is really Hezbollah as terrorist group. And now let's talk a little bit about Hezbollah's domestic role, to understand what that means. So Hezbollah is quite active also in the Lebanese political sphere. In the Lebanese scene, the Shia have been traditionally disenfranchised. The Lebanese state has not treated them as well as it could have, nor are they given positions commensurate with their numbers. And because of that, there's been a lot of frustration within the community. So Hezbollah has been seen as one of the two entities that really helps represent the Shia. And given that it is such an effective armed force in so many ways, that's furthered a lot of Shia support for it. Starting from 1992, Hezbollah began participating in the Lebanese political scene in an active way. And an intriguing part here that I think is worth mentioning, when Hezbollah leadership decided in 1992 to start participating in Lebanese elections, they made sure to get permission from the supreme leader in Iran, which is a worthwhile point. We'll talk a little bit about Hezbollah's relationships with its state sponsors, but this is something to remember, that this is a very close connection. So in 1992, it began participating in elections. 2005, it began participating in the cabinets, which is really where the strength is in Lebanon. And in recent years, it's had quite a bit of political power. It's had veto power in the cabinet, and more recently, if you've been watching really since about mid-January, it helped actually collapse the Lebanese government, and there's now a government formation process, which it's pretty clear that Hezbollah is behind the scenes, helping pull together what the formations of this new cabinet will look like. It has been challenged domestically in a few ways over the last few years. Really two ways. Number one is a national dialogue. There's been this robust dialogue in Lebanon that started about 2005, 2006. And the idea was get all of the major community leaders together and start talking about the issues. We know that in Lebanon there's this extremely fragile, undergoverned, misgoverned state. What can we do? Let's talk about some of the problems. And folks came together and they did talk about some issues like armed Palestinians. And they began to talk about Hezbollah's arms. And that was really the first time that there was any sort of dialogue on these issues. What came of it? Nothing. That said, I think it was still worthwhile because it was the first time that such a conversation happened. It was the first time that anyone really was able to stand up and say, having an extremely sophisticated armed force, stronger than the Lebanese military, is not a good thing for our state. And that is not an easy thing to say. So there was that national dialogue, which really argued about who has the monopoly on violence here. Is it the state or is it Hezbollah? The 2006 war showed what the case is, and there was interest by some camps in Lebanon to try to challenge this. The other domestic challenge that Hezbollah has faced in recent years has been what's known as the Special Tribunal for Lebanon. This was the investigation into the February 14th, 2005 assassination of former Prime Minister Hariri and countless others. The investigation over the last year or so appears to be potentially indicting members of Hezbollah, senior members of Hezbollah. I say appears and potentially because it's become a very secretive process, and indeed the sealed indictments were recently issued, but they remain sealed, so no one actually knows. But one of the keys that really makes, I think, a lot of us analysts think that Hezbollah has played a role is the extremely active effort Hezbollah has made since really August to discredit this tribunal, which shows how nervous they are about it, right? So over these last, say, 6-7 months or so, there's been a very robust effort by Hezbollah to explain why this tribunal is illegitimate, why it's not helpful, and why it's useless. And this is where one of these areas where, yes, Hezbollah poses a huge challenge to Lebanon, to U.S. national security policy, but we have to remember there are also some challenges to Hezbollah. And that's worth remembering, I think. And yet, of course, it is still prevailed. Right now, it appears as though the Special Tribunal for Lebanon is flailing at best. And what will really happen to it is debatable. In field work in Lebanon, I found many folks disinterested and really disinclined to support an active tribunal process because they've got very valid fears that supporting it will lead to a return to civil war. And when you're looking between justice and stability, there's a balance to be struck, but when one is on the ground, they're going to be a little bit more enthusiastic about stability probably than justice. And everyone's going to remember that Hezbollah does remain the most competent armed force in Lebanon. And it's managed to do so despite various efforts, so in 1989-90, when the civil war in Lebanon ended, there was an agreement that all armed militias should be disarmed. Well, Hezbollah then said, we're resistance, we're not an armed militia, and they found a way around it. And that's happened after the Israeli withdrawal in May 2000. Hezbollah said, well, we need to maintain our arms because there's some villages, there's Char, there's Sheva farms, there's other reasons. So they've always found ways to maintain their arms. There was one very critical point, which was in May 2008. And this was really the first time since the Civil War where Hezbollah turned its arms internally. The Lebanese government had tried to tackle some of these state-like apparatuses of Hezbollah. Hezbollah has a communications network, and they also had a very active presence at the Beirut International Airport. And the Lebanese government tried to tackle some of these and said, this is a problem, you can't have these. And the result was extremely violent street clashes in Beirut and then moving into the Shuf Mountains. And this is actually a pretty watershed period and has, I would argue that where we are today really started with what happened in May 2008. While I'm speaking about Hezbollah's domestic role, it's important to emphasize, yes, it participates politically. It also offers quite a few services. And this is where the issue of having such a weak Lebanese state becomes such a problem. Because Hezbollah is able to offer services that a state should be offering, right? So they should be offering access to education. They should be taking care of families of injured. They should be offering health clinics, community events, you name it. But the state is so weak that oftentimes the Lebanese will rely on their confessional groups. And this is where Hezbollah is playing a role, unfortunately. So it benefits immensely from having such a weak Lebanese state and such weak Lebanese state institutions. So thirdly, let's talk about the regional role of Hezbollah. And this is critical to understanding it because why is Hezbollah so powerful? Well, it's extremely powerful because of its assistance from Iran and from Syria, right? It's one thing to be an active player in the Lebanese scene. It's another thing to be an extremely active and well-equipped and well-trained actor in the Lebanese scene. In terms of the funding, Hezbollah receives hundreds of millions of dollars, it's estimated, from Iran. The training is extremely sophisticated. The equipment, the 2006 war started to surprise people in terms of what Hezbollah has. It's only managed to rearm and increase. Latest I've heard is 40,000 rockets or missiles in southern Lebanon. Southern Lebanon's pretty small, if you've ever been there, so if half of it's true, that's a lot. And another point worth mentioning is because of its active relationship with Iran, Hezbollah doesn't have to raise funds as actively as other terrorist groups, right? So if you're a group, not even a terrorist group, if you're a nonprofit organization, you spend a lot of time trying to raise funds, right, so you can function. Well, if you know that you're going to have a steady stream of funds, you're able to do your work, right? And then there'll be an iterative process and really a synergy because you'll be focused on doing your work. You'll be able to kind of weed out other actors in that regard because they're so focused on finding funding. So this is one of the ways that this relationship with Iran can be so useful. And I would add, and this is something you may wish to get into in the questions period, Hezbollah's existence is also Iran's big card, right? So when we look at the issues of a potential nuclear Iran, the big fears are what happens with Hezbollah? What does Hezbollah do? And we can talk about that maybe in the questions. And then Syria, of course. Syria is the other sponsor of Hezbollah. And I don't want it to appear as though this is some sort of real proxy relationship where, you know, Syria, Iran says jump and Hezbollah says how high. It's not that case. This is iterative, but there is this very, very close relationship. And any decision by Hezbollah not to respond positively to requests from Iran or from Syria will have to be considered under the guise of, well, how does it affect funding? How does it affect the assistance that we get from these states? So Syria also provides quite a bit of equipment. Interestingly, equipment from the Syrian military stockpiles. And this is a new dynamic. It's not something that's been seen before the last half decade or so. And you absolutely did not see this under Hafez al-Assad. But the current Syrian president has taken equipment from the Syrian military stockpiles and given it to Hezbollah, which I think is simply fascinating, right? He's now saying that I'm empowering this terrorist group to serve as part of my state's defense and perhaps offense. And I have so little faith in my military that I will take from its stockpiles for that reason, which I think is worth noting. Syria's other key aspect is that it's geography. And this is why when a lot of folks talk about a Syria-Israel peace deal and what this could mean, well, it would make getting aid to Hezbollah much more difficult since so much of that aid comes from land over this Syria-Lebanon border. and it's harder to transfer material by sea for various reasons. And so if you were able to cut that geographical link off, it would absolutely play a pretty significant role. Whether enough of a role for the Israelis to make a peace agreement, that's the million-dollar question. But that is really the critical point. And when we're also looking regionally, there's the relationship with Syria, there's the relationship with Iran. There's also the popular support issue. And we saw this in particular in the 2006 war, and since then, which is that Hezbollah has arguably more popular support outside of Lebanon among the Arab masses than it does in Lebanon. Polling has showed that the Lebanese Shia have very high support for Hezbollah, and generally the Lebanese Christians less so, and the Lebanese Sunni much less so, let alone the other confessional groups. But within so much of the region, and this is why what's happening now, one of the many reasons what's happening now will be so interesting to see what plays out, if you now no longer have what's seen as dictators who sort of follow American writ, that's kind of the stereotype, and I'm not saying that that's necessarily accurate, but that is the stereotype that so many have. So if you don't have it, and maybe there is a closer connection between populaces and their regimes, does support for a rogue actor like Hezbollah decrease? That's a possibility. It's something to consider. So a little bit about what's happening right now, and I'm sure there'll be quite a few questions on that since it is such a dynamic time. And for those of us who study this region, it's pretty rare that you have such dynamism and such vibrance. There are different arguments to be made, and really the arguments are here and there. They are that what's happening now in the region is good for Hezbollah or it's bad for Hezbollah. I will tell you my bias. I think in the long term, it is probably problematic for them. They benefited off of and benefited from grievances. And to the extent there are fewer grievances, and these are often, I should know, valid grievances, to the extent there are less of them and they're minimized, it will be less likely that folks will support an organization like Hezbollah. And removing such power brokers, I do believe in the long term will lessen the extent to which their message can resonate. But that's in the very, very long term. And if you're familiar at all with kind of democratization processes, state-building processes, this is a very, very messy decade plus that we're looking at. In short term, we don't know the fruits of these revolutions. I was just seeing that in Tunisia, they've now gone through a new leader. And so they realized after a couple weeks, just changing the fellow at the top doesn't change things. I suspect something very similar could happen in Egypt, which is probably why they set it up with the Supreme Military Council rather than one figurehead. And that's an important thing to know, is that in the short term, we don't know the fruits of these revolutions. More frustration could actually increase support for groups like Hezbollah. You now have more politically active populaces. Are they going to push for something different? And when they see that something different in a state manner doesn't fulfill their needs, will they look more towards non-state actors? We don't know. So now, what does this all mean for the U.S. government and for U.S. government policy? I think I've worked in a couple ideas in terms of what the U.S. can do. The bottom line is really, how do you increase challenges to a group like Hezbollah and minimize its strength? And I'd argue there's sort of the strategic path and there's the more tactical path. The tactical one is simply make it more difficult for Iran and Syria to aid Hezbollah. So maybe you're increasing monitoring of certain areas, you're doing whatever you can to stop overflights, and to just try to garner international pressure, more UN Security Council resolutions, if you're familiar with 1559, particularly 1701 also. More efforts to just tactically make it harder to help a group like Hezbollah. And then there's the strategic issue, which is help strengthen the Lebanese state. And this is one that I've worked on quite a bit in policy fora, and it's one that I can talk about more in questions if you'd like. It is, I will say, a deeply unsatisfying process because it is so long-term and it is so very messy. But you need to build a legitimate state. And for the Lebanese populace to feel as though they have actors that respond to their needs in a democratic way and in a legitimate way. So you build a real Lebanese military that is capable of exerting the government's sovereignty throughout Lebanon. You build a justice ministry that is seen as transparent, an internal security force that is seen as playing a positive role, and one that's for all Lebanese as opposed to, say, one confessional group or another. I mean, that's really the key. It is, as I said, unsatisfying, and it is extremely long-term. So now that I've perhaps disheartened all of your evenings, why don't I turn to a couple questions? Yes, please.
The recent Iranian cargo vessel that was heading towards Syria, can that be viewed as a casus belli, or is that Iran flexing its muscle, using Hezbollah as a proxy? What do you suppose who are they arming? Are they arming Hezbollah, or?
What are they doing, and why in the world do they do this?
Yes.
It's a great question.
Did everyone hear the question, by the way?
Why don't I repeat it? She asked a terrific question, which is the recent passage of Iranian ships through the Suez Canal. Of the Iranian warships through the Suez Canal. Why did they do it, and what's the purpose? Where's the assistance going? Well, I'll take the latter part first, which is where's it going? We don't know. It's entirely, it docked in Syria, the ship. So I think we can presume that it's going either to aid the Syrian military or more likely to be facilitated then to Hezbollah. That would be my instinct. I would say the idea of sending the warships was brilliant. I think it was an extremely smart move by the Iranians, which is that there haven't been any Iranian warships that have transited the Suez since the 1979 revolution. So what a perfect way to very tangibly force the new Egyptian government to show which side they're on. And a very perfect way to say to all of the Israeli strategic planners, who are surely up in arms over the last few weeks by what's happening in Egypt, to show them they really don't know what's going to happen here. And that even, Israel has sort of based its strategic assessments on this 30-plus years of peace with Egypt, and assuming a quiet border. If you no longer can have that assumption, it is a very different ballgame. And that's, forget assuming 100%, just 90% of support. If you only have 90 support for the Egyptian by the Egyptian government for the peace agreement with Israel, that can change what's going into Gaza, it can change the posture towards Gaza, it can change any Egyptian aid to the Palestinians, or even just, sins of omission. We'll let the ship go through. What do you do? I think it was a brilliant move on the Iranian government's part, unfortunately. Yes, please.
Whatever changes will come about because of these disruptions in the Middle East, it seems to me there's an economic basis in every one of them, okay? Wouldn't it be logical to assume that people will say, killing Israelis doesn't put food on my table, okay? I don't want to see my government send arms to Palestinians. Not until everybody in my country has food to eat, their children have good medical care, they have schools to go to, then maybe we can go kill Israelis. Is that liable to happen?
I think it's a terrific question. In case you didn't hear it, he was talking about the economic aspect here, which is that so much of what we've seen over these last few weeks has been economically focused, right? And it's really been kind of that economic issue that's translated into the political push. And will it therefore correlate with less focus on Israel? I think a lot of that depends on what the new regimes look like. If your new regimes do not allow free media, active civil society, then folks will focus on what they're allowed to speak about. And if you're only allowed to speak about supporting the Palestinians and anti-Israel vitriol, then so be it. That's what you will. I think the economic piece is a very worthwhile one, though. And you've probably all seen it, but it's something I'm really struck by. When you looked at the signs, and even I was reading a lot of the signs in Arabic when watching the news over these last few weeks, you weren't seeing signs about Israel. There was no discussion.
Today, yes. Today, yes.
Okay, today perhaps.
Today, yes.
Okay.
In Egypt.
Okay, so today in Egypt now, how many weeks after?
Big time.
And
Big
well,
hatred to Israel.
well, and that's a very interesting point then. If it's starting to emerge, that may be, that may be a sign that the situation is evolving. I don't know. But the fact is, when this all first started happening, we weren't seeing that. And there's something to be said here, right? Whenever we look at Middle East protests, what do you always see, right? You always see the anti-Israel vitriol. That's what you assume. There'll be popcorn and there'll be anti-Israel vitriol. But that wasn't the case. And if now that is, maybe this is saying something about the type of regime that the Egyptian government is facilitating. But economics are a problem. And this is why, one of my fears, and one of the reasons it makes it kind of hard to be excited by all the jubilation over these last few weeks, is that changing Mubarak will not change the GDP in Egypt. Changing Mubarak will not now give all of these young unemployed or underemployed Egyptians jobs. And when they realize that, then what happens? And that's a real challenge. I think there are some things that can be done by outside actors. So for instance, the high price of food. I think the US can be sending wheat shipments and other things, and that may mitigate on the margins. But overall, this is What's been happening are very internal processes. I was asked an interesting question on this recently where someone was saying, okay, so this is happening. Is there sort of any movement towards kind of a pan-Arab state again? Are we returning, to the days of Nasser? And what I found so intriguing is there's not that. Instead, what you're seeing is folks looking and saying, I see that happening in my state. I also have a dictator and I want change. So how do I change from within, from my state? And we're seeing that replicated, which is, simply fascinating. It's also dynamic, and look, in terms of what happens, it's any of our best guesses. Thank you, yes.
Yes, given the strength of Hezbollah and the dominant structure of the government, politically speaking, to what degree can the United States government exert leverage on them or even on the other subservient members of that constituency, the opposition to Hezbollah? How can the U.S. exert leverage?
So what can we do? It's a very good question, and it's something I wrestled with a lot while I was serving at the Pentagon. It was a different situation really from 2005 or so onward, when the Lebanese government was geared. It was generally led by folks anti-Israel, anti-Syria, and anti the nefarious role that Hezbollah can play within Lebanon. Then it was a bit of a different situation. And what the U.S. government tried to do then was to strengthen the Lebanese state. So we sent a lot of aid to the Lebanese military, for example, and tried to build them up, in particular very visible aid. So it became clear that the Prime Minister, the Minister of Defense, that these were all actors helping Lebanon become more of Lebanon. There's also the U.S., there were various visits by senior officials, a lot of statements, you name it. But at the end of the day, and this is, I think, an issue that translates into the region writ large, there's only so much that the U.S. or any outside actor can do. And I think the best thing, really, that I would advise now is to keep a close pulse on what's happening in the dynamics. I think long term, it's very clear that you want strong, stable institutions within Lebanon, within all of these states, and do what you can to build them, even though realizing there'll be many ups and downs, like this new government in Lebanon, which will surely not be as positive for U.S. national security interests as the previous one. Yes, sir.
Yes. The ships that went through the canal.
Yes.
Were they ships of the line, or were they transports or cargo ships? That would make a difference.
What kind of ships were they that went through the Suez? My understanding was that they were warships. That's all the reporting that I've seen.
No, they looked like cargo ships to me, which would indicate something.
Yes.
May I answer?
Sure.
I'm ex-military. I happen to take an interest in the U.S. Navy for various reasons.
Yes.
One was a small frigate, about 146 feet overall. Half the boats at the motor show were bigger, and the other was a small supply ship that went with it with fuel and supplies.
I see.
It was essentially a gesture. Iran only has a 5-ship navy. What it does have is millions of small ships to use to blockade the Gulf of Hormuz. But it was a gesture that cost them 10 cents, and it caused a great furore, and it was a very brilliant move.
Thank you. That's terrific
And by the way, the U.S.
clarification.
Navy goes through that all the time. The previous week, the Enterprise carried a task group went through that.
Yes, the U.S. absolutely does. In fact, much of what we've done in Iraq over these last few years has gone through the Suez. But of course, it's the nature
So it's just the show.
of the
It
actor.
actually didn't amount to anything.
We don't know. I mean, we don't know what was on the ship, but I would say it was 90% strategic communications. It was 90% a show saying to the Israelis and to everyone else in the region, look, you don't know what's going to come of this change in leadership over the Suez and ownership, in effect. You now have a different regime owning it. Yes, in the corner.
What happened in Egypt, was it actually a spontaneous grassroots revolution, so-called, or there's some shadows behind the scenes players that ignited the whole thing?
It's a good question. I don't know if you all heard it, but he was asking about what happened in Egypt. Was this extemporaneous, or were there sort of these shadowy, Kermit Roosevelt type actors perhaps trying to facilitate them? I mean, this is a question for the history books, and this is the problem with trying to discuss something so contemporary. It appears as though it was generally extemporaneous, and that it just happened out of the Egyptian populace's own volition. I read some very good information about sort of the massing of various Egyptian groups over these last 2 years or so, and trying different tactics on how to be politically effective, various manuals that have gone around on how to do so. But I think your question is worthwhile, in particular if you look at the region more broadly. I mean, surely there will be suspicions that certain actors have played roles in this, whether the Americans, the Iranians, you name it, any of that. The one place where I think any of that could be a possibility, and I still heavily caveat this, would be Bahrain. And that's because you do have a majority Shia population ruled by a Sunni, the Sunni Khalifa family. And Iran has had a history of meddling in Bahrain, much different than it's had in Egypt or Libya, for example, or Tunisia. I have not seen any evidence of this, so I'm not saying that this is necessarily the case. But we're one to think, perhaps, is there a place where maybe this could be the case? Bahrain would be the one. Yes, ma'am.
What we'd really like to see succeed, I think, is the revolution in Iran. But considering what the regime has already done to slaughter its people, is there any hope there?
It's a terrific question. You know, when I first came to Washington to work on Middle East issues more than a decade ago, I remember having a conversation with someone who said, the Iranian regime is about to fall. Well, you can tell that clearly has not happened. And so it's a robust gambling field and not one I would ever bet in. So what will happen? The challenge is, you know, the Iranian government has been really adept at putting down these protests. We've seen this from really summer 2009 onward. They've had some smart tactics, smart if this is your goal, right? So they've understood authoritarian dictator 101 is that you pull out all the stops. They have kind of these, not really rogue actors, but they have kind of black-shirted type actors that can go and do whatever they want in terms of silencing folks. And what I thought was especially smart is they made a very active effort to target the mid-level of the opposition groups, so of the Green Movement. So they know if you focus on the top folks, everyone in the international community is going to pay attention, right? They'll say, oh no, we know him, we know this means you are doing this. No one knows the names of the mid-level folks, when those are really the ones, you know, those aren't, I'm not saying the top folks are figureheads necessarily, but it's the mid-level operators that are so effective. So if you're able to arrest them, torture them, capture them, you name it, you really can help make a movement more impotent. And I think, unfortunately, they've done that pretty well. Even in these recent protests, they have shown no willingness to allow anything, which is probably smart because, you know, the minute Iran will start to leak, it'll leak like a sieve. Actually, I'm going to go to this side. Yes?
We're led to believe that the majority, the bulk of the support for Hezbollah comes from Iran. So what are we talking about in dollar terms? What kind of support are they getting? What percentage is that of Hezbollah's budget? And as interesting, where is the rest of Hezbollah's budget coming from?
It's a great question. So he was asking, you know, Hezbollah has all this money. Where's it coming from? We know some comes from Iran. How much? And where's the rest of it coming from? So we don't know Hezbollah's budget. That would be terrific if someone can figure that out. But I don't believe it's known. The estimates that the U.S. Defense Department makes are that Hezbollah receives approximately 100 to 200 million per year from Iran. Those are the official estimates. And where does it get the rest of its money? The Lebanese Shia community has done very well. Proportionally, we don't know. We don't know. I mean, I have not seen any good figures in all the literature on Hezbollah, nor have I heard anyone, you know, whispering it. So I don't know. I would think that the 100 to 200 million has to be pretty substantial as a number figure in their budget. A lot of assistance will come from Lebanese Shia because the Shia have done quite well in places like West Africa, particularly in like the diamond trade, for example. So they'll come from money there. There's also one thing you'll see if you spent any time in Beirut in the Dahieh, which are the southern suburbs where Hezbollah is quite strong, or even in southern Lebanon. In fact, I've seen this in Lebanon on the border with Israel, where you see these blue boxes that look like this, and these are blue donation boxes to Hezbollah, and these are all over the place. So there's also kind of just that, you know, that average person helping out and helping support it. There's direct support to Hezbollah institutions, right? So Hezbollah's think tank in Dahieh, or the Hezbollah hospitals or clinics, you name it. And so that's one of the reasons I think that it's just so difficult to get kind of a holistic figure. But a lot of the assistance comes from the Lebanese Shia community in particular. Yes?
Just today, they mentioned that the United States Army in the Mediterranean is slowly moving towards Libya. And considering that we're involved in Iraq and involved in Afghanistan, and I mean, how can we be big brother to everybody, and what do you think we are trying to do by moving a few of our ships over towards Libya?
Okay, it's a good question. So if you didn't hear it, her question was, the U.S. is now moving some assets toward Libya. What in the world are we thinking, given that we're involved in Iraq, Afghanistan, etc.? I would say two things. Number one is, there is a continuum in terms of U.S. Military force. And it's not necessarily ground invasion, which I think a lot of folks kind of go, 0 to 100 in terms of what our paradigms are. And there's much more that can be done. And I think what the Obama administration is trying to do is to be a little more creative. So perhaps they hope that simply having ships near Libya will make Qaddafi nervous. Perhaps they think that they could impose a no-fly zone, which there's been a lot of discussion. Right, there's been a lot of discussion on that, and it worked quite well in Iraq. If you remember, we had Operation Northern Watch, Operation Southern Watch. And that was one way to help protect the Sunni and Kurdish populations in Iraq. So because Qaddafi has relied so heavily on air power, that is one option. So I think they're trying to look at very creative ways to try to stop the killing. I remember a lot of the folks who are in office right now are folks who were around during events like Rwanda and Bonita. And the last thing they want is to have a repeat of that on their watch. And so there are things we can do in Libya. I think there are extremely creative things. So for instance, the Treasury Department just this weekend halted about 30 billion Libyan assets. It's the largest amount that's ever been targeted. Those kind of things are important. But those are more in sort of kind of a medium to long term. Qaddafi won't stop killing people in the street because of them, but it'll make it harder for him to operate. So that's, I think, what they're looking at. And you brought in toward the end of your question this idea of, can we really be the policeman for all? And this is one of the big challenges, I think, of the U.S. role, particularly in a declining economy, is trying to figure out, so what's appropriate for us? And if not us, then who? Is it, and I would argue, it's kind of like Churchill's quote, democracy is the worst form of government except for every other one. I think this is a lot of the issue with the United States and its role, which is, the U.S. is the worst superpower except for every other one. If it's not the U.S. playing the role in so many of these areas, then whom? We've seen what the Chinese are doing and how the Chinese operate in a lot of places. They have very different, vision of what's appropriate than the U.S. does. So if it's not us, then who is it? But if it is us, how can we sustain that? And how does that work? And I think these are unfortunately terrific academic dilemmas, much less so terrific policy dilemmas. Yes?
Who trains Hezbollah?
Hezbollah generally receives its training from Iran, some from Syria, but mainly from Iran. And indeed, in the 1980s, in the Bekaa Valley, which is really the border of Lebanon and Syria, Hezbollah had set up all these terrorist training camps that really, in effect, became a university for various terrorist groups. I've done some studying on it, and it's simply fascinating when you look at the groups that trained there, from Badr Meinhof to Japanese Red Army, Nicaraguan Contras, you name it, all sorts of folks were coming together and training, to say nothing of Hamas, PIJ, etc. So they have a very active, if you're familiar with military parlance, one thing the U.S. military does is train the trainer. So the idea is you train someone who's competent and they pass that training on. Fortunately, Hezbollah has master-trained the trainer quite well, too. Way back there.
What's the strategic goal of this organization? Because if it's to take over Lebanon, so at one point they will have to do what the Hamas is doing in Gaza now, like taking care of sewer and the food for the people instead of giving them 1701 resolution and missiles.
No, it's a fantastic question. He had asked, if you didn't hear it over here, so what's the strategic goal of Hezbollah? What is it that they want? You'll get different answers from different people about what they want. Some will say they simply want to be Lebanonized, right? They simply want to become yet another actor in Lebanon. Some will say they want to do whatever Iran wants in Lebanon. I think actually Hezbollah's strategic goal is to be able to maintain its ability to do whatever it wants. And it's done that quite well, right? So they don't have the onus that Hamas has put on them of being responsible for sewage in Gaza and having to fight about alcohol prohibitions and hijab and you name it. And yet they also can benefit from the government and benefit from sort of the failures of its institutions, but also the existence of such institutions. So I think that's their goal, to be able to continue to maintain their posture and do as they want. But they have a balance to be struck here, right? So they need to keep support among the Lebanese populace, at a minimum among the Lebanese Shia, ideally more broadly. And that's why they've since entered into a pact over these last few years with the Lebanese Christian leader, Michel Aoun, which has been mutually beneficial. So they need to maintain that support so that they can operate. But they also need to maintain their support from various actors like Syria and Iran. so that they can stay so strengthened. And this is a dance that Hezbollah needs to do, and they've been quite proficient at doing so. So despite losing actors like Imad Mounia in February 12th, 2008, or others, they managed to continue this quite well. Back there.
How widespread is the idea that Lebanon is part of greater Syria, both in Lebanon and Syria?
It's a good question. So he asked, how prominent is this idea about a greater Syria in Lebanon and Syria? I would say in Lebanon, not so much. In Syria, very much so. The two countries only recently established diplomatic relations. They've only recently established embassies and exchange ambassadors. They didn't have them for decades and decades. And it's because the Syrians have always seen Lebanon as part of their own. I mean, they didn't like the idea of the establishment of a state in 1943. And they wanted to maintain their hold over it. The Syrian military occupation, you might remember, was from 76 to 05. And there's still a very active covert Syrian presence there. There's also, the Syrians have a lot of political allies that they work through, particularly in the Christian community. So all that said, the Lebanese, generally, I have not yet found a single Lebanese who likes the notion of a greater Syria. But in Syria, it is absolutely a more popular notion. In the corner.
Does Hezbollah play a role in suppressing unrest in Iran? Because we heard reports in the various unrest in the past that people didn't speak Farsi, and there were speculation that it might be them.
I've also seen a lot of reports on this. I wouldn't be surprised. I wouldn't be surprised. Given how capable that they are, it's entirely possible. I can't say I've seen any reports that I feel very confident on to categorically say yes. But given Hezbollah's proficiency, it's entirely possible. I mean, remember, Iran has invested a lot of time and resources in Hezbollah, and so I think it's safe to say the government in Tehran would like to be able to use it when it's helpful. And if you're Hezbollah, I don't see what you really have to lose by putting down protesters in Iran. I mean, it's not something that would really be harmful to them. You traditionally have a very close historical relationship, centuries and centuries, actually, between the Lebanese Shia community and Iran. In fact, when the Persian Empire decided to become Shia, they had Shia religious leaders from Jabal Amal in southern Lebanon. They paid for them to go to Iran, to the Persian Empire, and teach how to become Shia. So historically, you've had that sort of, more broadly, that close connection, and Hezbollah is a sort of I would say, unhealthy manifestation of it. Yes?
The turmoil now in different countries in the Middle East, do you think that could have any effect in the 16 million Muslims living in Europe? Could it affect different countries in Europe? Could trigger what they envisioned the beginning of, recuperate Al-Andalus, Spain, and then go on with the rest?
That's a very worthwhile question, and it's one that hasn't been asked enough. In case you didn't hear it on this side, it's given everything that's been happening in the Middle East, is it going to influence the Arab and Muslim populations in Western Europe? It's a worthwhile question because so often the Arabs and Muslims in Western Europe are discriminated against, and there's been a lot of frustration on that. I mean, we're very familiar, I'm sure, with the cases in the Netherlands, in France, you name it. And so what will they do? In some ways it'll be more difficult because you're not going to find consensus throughout the state, and you never have consensus throughout the state. That's a slight exaggeration, but in terms of the consensus that's existed, say, in Egypt in getting rid of Mubarak, one's not going to see that among all French citizens to get rid of Sarkozy. Maybe you'll see it among the Muslim and Arab populations, and I think if such sort of uprisings do occur, I think that the impact will be that Europeans will become even more fearful and frustrated with those populations, and it will be problematic in that term. Yes, sir.
Tom Friedman in the Times had an article where he went to school in Egypt 30 years ago, and the skyline today is the same as it was 30 years ago. Isn't the problem basically that the corruption in all these companies and the infrastructure doesn't permit those leaders to put money back into the economy and doesn't create jobs? And is this whole situation just a revolving issue and going to remain the same forever?
Corruption is a big problem, absolutely, at all levels of these places, of all levels of these states. And this is why when we're looking at the Egyptian military taking over, well, how much change will the Egyptian military support when they're involved in land deals and they benefit so much from the current situation? It's probably not in their interest to change things too much. And so how will they strike that balance? I think it plays a role, absolutely. I don't think it is the defining role, though. I think there are other issues beyond that. I don't think it's simply that a dictator like Qaddafi and his regime are so corrupt that because of that corruption, they're not providing access to civil society, free media, etc. I think there's more to it, but that absolutely does play an important point. I mean, there's all sorts of great studies that talk about how difficult it is to open a business or to get a patent in a lot of these countries. And if you can't do that, how can you begin to really change things economically?
This comment, the gentleman before talked about economics, how it might, it seems to me for the first time, the people that have been, the dictatorships that have been maintained for so long in the Middle East, in part stayed that way by having Israel be a scapegoat. Everybody was blaming all their problems on Israel. Now for the first time it seems like that's being washed away, that the people in Egypt and some of these other countries are saying, Israel is really not our problem. But they're finally, I think that's going to go away. That's how I feel.
It may. I think it would be a wonderful thing if it's the case. And I think it's safe to say none of us know.
I think Israel will be less used as a scapegoat.
Oh, it matters. I really believe so much this matters on what the fruits of these revolutions look like. So if they don't succeed in the visions of those who triggered them, then it's entirely possible that will continue to be the case. I mean, deep down, one finds, in any experience you may have in the Arab world, deep down you find so many folks will admit, we know the real issue isn't Israel. But that's not what we're permitted to speak about, and we know we're not changing anything else.
Like we were talking about Hariri being assassinated. Seems like everybody, based on what's happened, everybody knows that, Hezbollah had probably something to do with the assassination of Hariri. But you're not allowed to say it, or at least it's being suppressed. That information is now being suppressed. It's different once you say something out loud. And I'm saying that we are seeing, going on right now, the Muslim people who have been under dictators, they're now saying that the governments are corrupt, their leadership is corrupt.
There's something to be said for
want something better in this
right.
life.
There's something to be said for the unprecedented nature of what's been happening. And that's why I think it's so hard for anyone to predict. I mean, anyone who tells you how this will play out a year from now, I don't know that I would trust them so much. So we don't know what it will look like. But the point you brought up about Hariri's assassination, there has been a vibrant dialogue. And Lebanon is pretty unique because its civil society is more robust than a lot of the region. But there has been a robust dialogue about Syria's possible implication, about Hezbollah's possible implication. My personal opinion is that given the hold both of those actors had on Lebanon in 2005 when the assassination was conducted, I think they both probably at least knew something was happening. I don't think you could conduct an assassination of that magnitude. If you've ever been to where it is in downtown Beirut, I mean, this was a massive multi-ton blast. I think they had to know something was up, and they probably were involved in some way. Yes.
The topic was U.S. foreign policy. So can you discuss the synergy between the various branches of for example, the Obama administration, the State Department, Congress, towards the different countries in the Levant, whether they favor rapprochement or boycott, sanctions, etc.? Thank you.
This is a good question. It's a complicated question, so I'll tackle it as best I can in a short answer. So she was asking about the different aspects of the U.S. government, say the State Department, the White House, Congress, Defense Department, and what their policies are towards the Levant and what they're trying to work out. In particular, the Obama administration came in emphasizing two issues, which is trying to deal with the Arab-Israeli peace process and also engagement with actors where the U.S. has had little to no engagement during the Bush administration. So that would be actors like Syria or Iran. And so they pushed both of those robustly with perhaps less success, I mean arguably less success than I think any of them had hoped. Generally, if we're going to look at the executive branch will generally try to speak with one voice, even though clearly that's not the case below the surface. I mean, generally they have actively pushed this effort to engage actors like Syria. In fact, President Obama recently did what's known as a recess appointment and sent the new U.S. Ambassador Robert Ford out to Damascus just about a month and a half ago. They've also appointed Senator Mitchell to try to deal with Arab-Israeli issues and peace process issues. So the executive branch has had a more robust effort in this regard, and Congress has been more skeptical. Congress, of course, given the multiplicity of actors, can also afford to be more skeptical. So there has been much less enthusiasm for such engagement by Congress. And also, on the Arab-Israeli front, generally Congress has been hesitant out of fears that such a push will be problematic for the Israelis. Does that answer your question somewhat?
Well, I wanted to know more of the synergy, like who's calling the shots on the State Department, and then we have our ambassador to the UN, and there just seems to be so much push me, pull you. They're not really speaking with one voice. Who's calling the shots?
It's a great question. Okay, so who's calling the shots? Well, so as you probably know, sort of any interagency discussion in the U.S. government over history is dependent on the power of the individuals. And there are different formats for setting up that kind of dialogue, right? So there's the Kissinger format. Kissinger was extremely powerful, and Kissinger, practically was a one-man State Department, a one-man National Security Council staff, and was able to set that policy. This White House has also been quite centralized. It's not Kissingerian. It's not that extreme, but it is an extremely empowered White House in those regards. So a lot of folks will say that policy is very much made in the White House. The State Department, the Pentagon, et cetera, they have roles, but in this administration, it's the White House that's really pulling a lot of those strings. And it's worth emphasizing that is not always the case. There are other times where the State Department is more active, or the Pentagon. My personal opinion is that so much of that is tied to the personalities and the types of personalities that you get in these various jobs. If you have someone who's more of a leader, and who knows really how to manipulate their resources, then they can have more of an impact. So that's kind of what characterizes this White House. A lot of questions, my gosh. Yes, ma'am.
This is a very simple question. What is the translation of Hezbollah?
It's a great question. So what does Hezbollah mean? Very good question. So Hizb means party in Arabic, and Allah means God. So it is the party of God, literally. Yes, all the way back.
I know the fruits of labor, what have you, might not be seen. It's a lot of speculation, but could democracy in Egypt be bad for Egypt, for the United States, and for Israel? So the question is, there's an assumption that democracy would be good, but could be bad.
So this is what if we look at the literature on democratization, what we generally see is that in the very long term, democracy is good for say, in domestically, what a state looks like, right? It'll support human rights, robust civil society, free media, you name it, and also good for its relations with other countries. That's in the very long term, and that's assuming mature democracies. This is a very messy process to get there. It's not a popular thing to say, but there is some benefit in not having democracies, right? You know exactly who to talk to. Remember the famous Kissinger quote about, I call Europe, who do I talk to? I don't know who is Europe. This is when you called Egypt, you knew exactly who to talk to. Now there's a multiplicity of actors. We're not really sure who are the relevant ones, who are the power players, and will they remain so tomorrow? So there's just a lot of uncertainty that's played into it. There's also something to be said for an authoritarian government can sort of exert its writ on the policies it wants. So if you look at like treaty negotiations, right? So an administration goes and negotiates a treaty, but what happens? The Senate has to come back and vote on the treaty. So if you have a country like Syria that you're negotiating a treaty with, let's do Israel and Syria here, right? For the Israelis, there's going to have to be some sort of democratic input. For Syria, Assad says there is now a treaty. The treaty is writ. If in some ways that can be very convenient, but in the very long term, that can be problematic. So that's really the challenge here posed by these issues, and it's why the sort of decision makers today are just having such a challenging time trying to figure this all out. And for all the students there will be quite a bit of job security if you're looking at this field.
Laura, should we take maybe 2 to 3 more questions?
Sure.
Yeah, I think that's, yeah.
Great. So let me call on someone I haven't called on, all the way back there.
I'm wondering whether there are technology contexts of these conflicts related to shipping more distance than the Syria area, and whether those relate to the long-range acoustic device, which has advanced forms of weaponry aspects.
I'm not sure I completely understood your question. Maybe you could clarify it just a little bit?
There was a story in the Economist, December 5th, 2004, about the jointly developed tactical non-lethal weaponry called the long-range cruiser device. And although there are private forms of that, I'm wondering whether this also relates to shipping communication, and is that related to weaponry uses?
So
that
it-
might be at stake.
So let me make sure I understand you correctly. So you're talking about that the sort of pulsating device for when you have protests in crowds and you're trying to stall them?
Right. That
Right.
In a,
I'm not familiar, so she's asking a question. There's a device that various militaries have which kind of emits a pulse, so that let's say your protesters, you're coming towards me, the pulse comes out, and then you're not able to come towards me anymore. So if there's some sort of equivalent in the shipping sphere, I'm not familiar with it. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist, though. That's really, it's not something I would be quite smart on, to be honest. Yes.
Hamas was mentioned, Hezbollah you spoke about in great detail, and you have also touched on Libya, Tunisia, and Egypt. What about the Muslim Brotherhood? What is their role in all of this? I mean, it seems to me that they are extremely important.
They are extremely important. You're absolutely right. I will be the first to tell you I'm not an expert on the Muslim Brotherhood at all in Egypt. What I can tell you, having talked to some friends who are smart on it, is that there aren't a lot of folks who know what it's thinking and what it wants. And that's really the challenge. I teach a graduate class on Middle East Studies at Johns Hopkins, and I was looking for some good literature on the Muslim Brotherhood for them, and I haven't found some great things. Foreign Affairs website recently had something about a week and a half ago, if you want to look it up. But the bottom line is, I think there's a lot we don't know about the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and what it wants. I would say one of the real dangers of it being the only organized political entity besides the Egyptian regime is that it will make it a lot easier for it to succeed over these coming months because they are already mobilized. But in terms of what they really want, I'm just not sure. So I think I'm up to one last question. All right, last question back.
Is Russia a bystander with Hezbollah?
This is a great question. Is Russia a bystander with Hezbollah? I think I can safely say Russia's not really a bystander at all in the Middle East, and I would argue generally it doesn't play a very helpful role. Russia is one of the 4 members of the Quartet. The Quartet was this entity established, oh my gosh, now almost a decade ago, I suppose, to help deal with Middle East peace process issues. So in that guise, Russia is trying to facilitate Arab-Israeli peace, but in a lot of ways it's not. So Russia sends a lot of material to places. In fact, it was just recently announced about some new anti-ship devices it's going to send to the Syrians. Russia sells a lot of destabilizing aid. And what's been intriguing is I don't know if it's that their end-use monitoring system isn't as robust as the American one, or they simply don't care. But this aid has gone to Hezbollah in some respects. So the best example of this is during the 2006 war. If you're familiar with the Cornet anti-tank missiles, so the Cornets were from Russia, as you can tell by the name, K-O-R-N-E-T. So the Cornets were from Russia, sold to the Syrian military. Assad diverted them to Hezbollah, and they were actually the weapon that was responsible for the destruction of the Merkava tanks in the 2006 war. So these were game-changing weapons in the fight. So Russia does not play a helpful role, in my opinion, in terms of what it's doing at all. I don't know if that, a lot of it is just trying to sort of bolster its domestic arms industry. I think a lot of it is trying to counter the U.S., given sort of historic competition between the U.S. and Russia in the Middle East. But it is problematic, I would say. So I should probably wrap up. You all are getting tired. Thank you so much.